Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Parliament Podcast. I am your host, Andy Segadin, online managing editor of TLR Review Volume 91. On today's episode, we'll be discussing recent trends and considerations in immigration law, particularly from a business perspective, with Temple Law alumni Jonathan Grode. We know that immigration is a hotly debated topic right now, particularly with the upcoming midterm election, and so we hope today's episode is both informative and enjoyable. Thank you.
We are very excited to welcome Jonathan Grode to the podcast today. Jonathan is the practice director for Green and Spiegel, working in the area of business immigration law here in Philadelphia. He is a 2008 graduate of Temple Law and still visits campus regularly as an adjunct professor. He'll be teaching business immigration law this spring. He's here today to discuss some of the changes that his field has undergone in recent years, and though I do want to discuss some of the news topics out there, I'm very excited to learn about how some of the more day-to-day evolutions have occurred in his practice. And without further ado, I'll welcome Jonathan. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So I'm just going to jump right into it because there's a lot to talk about, and especially in these past few weeks that's gone on. And I guess obviously I want to start from relatively the very beginning. A lot of what we're seeing in action today was signaled to us 2 years ago during the 2016 presidential election. Shortly after President Trump was elected, you made several predictions yourself. You predicted federal mandates on employee electronic verification. You predicted H-1B reform. You predicted a renegotiated NAFTA. A lot of that has obviously happened, and we'll get to those in a moment. But has anything about these past 2 years surprised you or struck you as interesting or anything like that?
I guess when Trump got elected, I never really anticipated the size and scope of his ability to influence adjudications of cases, the way the officers view applications and petitions simply through executive orders, executive fiats, and frankly just general rhetoric. If you look at the trends in adjudications across the board, requests for evidence when you file something and they come back and ask for additional questions, and case denials have gone through the roof. For example, with H-1Bs under the last year of Obama, and H-1B is sort of your quintessential working visa, we were sitting around a denial rate of about 7.8%. This year, or the last year we have figures for, which is 2017, that denial rate was up near 30%. And that wild change in the behavior of the adjudications has led to a lot of uncertainty for the business climate and has made immigration itself just very unpredictable. That I never really anticipated him having such a far reach without actually being able to pass any significant law changes.
Interesting. And there are, I guess, a few changes, and I guess one of the things that I want to talk to you about out of your predictions is we're talking now on the evening of October 30th. Tomorrow's not only Halloween, but it is the end of a 6-month pilot of a new U.S.-Canadian visa arrangement that I've always read is supposed to lead to a streamlined process, but it's hit some snags as some of the on-the-spot processing that people have come to depend on is no longer available at service stations. And then along the southern border, as you kind of alluded to, President Trump has made immigration a focus of a renegotiated North American trade agreement. I guess from a business immigration perspective, how have you seen the U.S. interact with its neighbors to the north and south? And I guess, do you have any, general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a great question. So they tried this pilot program for the processing of intercompany transferees along the border at the Blaine, Washington port of entry. And nobody's really used it. I think they had something like 15 cases filed, and only 3 of them were approved without request for evidence, and you went from an instantaneous adjudication to something that took weeks and weeks and weeks. So it was an absolute mess. So you're not getting any real buy-in there. What they're doing along the Mexican border is interesting, but to be honest with you, when they came up with the United States-Mexico-Canadian agreement that's yet to be voted on but is going to replace NAFTA, they didn't actually change anything with the immigration schedule. There was a lot of talk that it was going to expand. That's what a lot of people were hoping for. With respect to Mexico, the thought was actually that they were going to maybe take away the TN, the Treaty NAFTA visa for Mexican nationals, but it is exactly the same. I mean, it is copied into the new agreement word for word, so that really hasn't changed. But the thing that's interesting that doesn't really get picked up a lot on in the media is actually what Canada has done with its migration policy in response to the way Trump has been treating the business immigration community. And specifically what they've done is they've created this fast access visa for tech workers, those who are really getting hurt by some of that H-1B stuff I was talking about, whereby you can get a work permit to work for a U.S. subsidiary in Canada in less than 2 weeks. In less than 2 weeks. And what that's really doing is prompting a number of businesses to set up operations in Canada, and the phenomena is called nearshoring, where they're having people operating in the same time zone, dealing with tech work that are able to respond to questions of U.S. customers seamlessly. And it's remarkable because, one, it's not getting any sort of discussion in the media. In Canada, it is discussed, of course. But down here, you know, Trump is arguing from this perspective that these policies are creating and saving jobs for U.S. workers, but in reality, the trend, albeit slow and smaller than, you know, massive companies and a mass exodus, a lot of well-known companies, including Microsoft, have set up new operations in Canada as a mechanism for overcoming the visa challenges that we're seeing here. So it's not so much what we're doing to our neighbors, although that is having an impact. With the case of Canada, it's almost like what are they doing to counteract what we've started to institute? So that's the biggest change I've seen.
And staying along those lines, you mentioned I guess the tech aspect of that, and you also did predict H-1B reform. And I was reading a few articles in preparation for this, and one in the Mercury News reported, I guess, a proposed visa lottery that would favor workers with graduate degrees from American institutions, and that would benefit, you know, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Microsofts of the world that generally attract these workers. Similarly, there's I guess some panic in India with I guess denial rates. I know you mentioned the 30%. I think that's what Forbes had for the first quarter of 2018, and I was reading I guess Homeland Security data in the 4 years leading up to President Trump's election. It was at 17.6%, and that was even itself a high denial rate compared to the earlier Obama years. I guess what is the future of the H-1 visa from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the H-1B is severely oversubscribed.
Mm-hmm.
Like last year, for example, when the window opened, they got 190,000 petitions filed for 85,000 spots. And that was actually down from the apex a few years back where they got 236,000 petitions filed for 85,000 spots. So what you see is companies are really being aced out by the lack of availability of H-1B visas, which has led to some of those trends that we were talking about with Canada.
Sure.
What doesn't get reported as much, and where I actually think the administration is correct in trying to address a problem, is that the companies that are applying for the most H-1B visas are not the ones you think of. You know, most people will say Amazon and IBM and companies like that. And while Microsoft itself is a big employer of H-1B workers, the number one employers are these Indian outsourcing companies.
Mm-hmm.
So Tata and Infosys and companies like that that are essentially sucking up all the numbers. And, you know, in reality, what's happening here is you have a lot of foreign students who come to the United States, invest a lot of money in their education here, and want to be hired by these U.S. companies. And because they're being flooded, because the market is being flooded by applications by people that don't have an existing nexus to the United States, it's creating a problem. So to try to favor those that have been educated here over those that don't have a nexus to the United States, I actually think is sound policy. But I don't think that alone, and I'm not really sure what the mechanism that the government's going to come up with. Supposedly they're going to be announcing something soon, but we haven't heard of anything specifically yet. They said they're going to try to propose something next week, but they said, I think I think they said it was coming out in the summer, in the spring. They've been talking about this for a while. So, we'll see where it comes out in relationship to the general election. But my point is that alone is not going to cure the issue. I still think you do need to increase the numbers across the board by cutting out, the lack of progression of people that have invested in this country and their education. I think it is a decent move by the administration if they're able to figure out a way to actually enact it. And I'll be curious to see what form or substance that takes. But yeah, there is some legs to H-1B visa reform in that regard. Will it overcome and counterbalance the harsh adjudications, the fact that they aren't paying deference to previous adjudications of cases? That's yet to be seen if that will effectuate a policy change in that regard. But fundamentally, the issue that you're identifying is one that has been a problem spanning back to the previous administration, and whether it's through an act of Congress or some way of modifying the regulations, that will probably be very welcome to the foreign student population and the universities.
Now, there's probably 20 different follow-ups to ask on that answer, but I'll stick with just one. And keeping with H-1B visas, and you mentioned several times in your answer, talking about people who have been educated in this country and who have, I guess, invested, at least in that regard, in this country. Mm-hmm. I want to speak briefly about young people, maybe some people who are even here at Temple. There was a report in Axios a couple of weeks ago that there were a few thousand recent graduates who are on F1 student visas, and they have since lost, prospective jobs due to processing delays in getting work visas. And I've read some other articles and reports about, overall concerns among American universities about attracting foreign students, if this might end up being the case. I guess for students that might be listening with some uncertainty about their own situations, or maybe about a sibling considering coming to America as well for schooling, what would your message be to them? Is it kind of similar along the kind of reform that you were describing with H-1Bs?
Well, I think actually that's referring to the issue we're seeing in post-completion employment authorization. So essentially what it is when you finish a degree course of study, you're afforded a year of employment authorization to apply the skills that you learned. Okay. Now, the problem is that those applications used to take 2 to 3 months to adjudicate. The Trump administration has really pulled back processing times on these. So now they're spanning into the 5-6 month range in some instances. And that's hurting individuals' ability to get employment authorization in a timely manner to satisfy requirements for employers. It was actually under Obama, right before he left, where they changed the rule. It used to be by law they had to adjudicate these things in 90 days, and they changed that to a 180-day time frame. Mm-hmm. But they didn't correspondingly increase the advanced filing that a student can make. You can still only apply 90 days prior to your graduation. So it's created this little lurch. What I would say to students is the tools haven't changed. They're still exactly the same. And, they very well could change, but for right now we're dealing with the same system. It's just more broken. Things are taking longer. So I think you need to be very pragmatic in your approach to your immigration status. Don't wait. Have a game plan. And universities like Temple are excellent because Temple really has one of the best foreign student advisor services I've seen in the country. And they're a great resource to work with you. In fact, I know because I speak at them, but Temple has sessions for students to talk about how to handle visas after graduation, how to get your OPT, how to set yourself up if you want to be an entrepreneur and start your own business. So universities are aware of this issue, Temple in particular, and, they are providing resources to help you. Is it a challenging time? Yes. But if you do take a pragmatic approach to your immigration and you're proactive and don't wait for it to come to you, oftentimes you can not necessarily quell some of these issues, that we're talking about in terms of processing times, but you can alleviate it so that there's less of a wait and less of an issue waiting for adjudication.
Now, I think one of the buzzwords in immigration in recent months and years, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's been a lot of talk about merit-based or something similar. Essentially, the desire to bring in immigrant workers that can spark innovation, who can add to our economy, and again, still kind of focused on the types of skilled workers that many of your clients might be bringing in. I guess, what has merit-based immigration looked like in America? And I guess, where do you think that's going? And I guess, where do you think that end product, kind of how does that compare to the other world economic powers?
So, yeah, I know they preach this concept of, like, let's bring in the best and the brightest, and we've always called that the brain drain theory
Yeah.
on immigration. We want the best people to circulate here. In reality, I don't think they practice it. I mean, we have visa classifications available for the best and the brightest. And they are considerably facing, harsher adjudications on a regular basis. That would be the O1 classification and the corresponding green card version, which is EB1. So they've come under tremendous scrutiny and higher denial rates and requests for evidence. And the funny case that I often tell, my students about, but we represented this fella that was a multiple-time Olympic gold medalist, and he was coming here to do a similar type of competition. And, we included the gold medal, and we had all sorts of records of him in the press and everything. I mean, this guy's at the top of his field of endeavor, And the government came back and proved to us that he's extraordinary, even though we gave them more than enough evidence. So it's like these are the kind of arbitrary decisions that we're seeing as this trend for more stringent adjudication is taking hold and changing behavior. Whereas a couple of years ago, that would have been like the easiest filing ever. It's starting to get questioned. So I don't know how sincere the government really is about this, attracting the best and the brightest. I mean, even Melania Trump herself, who got one of these extraordinary ability petitions filed, and I think she probably merited it under the standard, but I wouldn't be surprised if that petition was filed today, that she would have a tough go at it, just because of how the trends are and where she was in her career when she made that submission. So, yes, I think they are playing lip service to this idea that we want the best and the brightest and end family migration, but in practice, in reality, it's nowhere near that.
And does that tie in with, I guess, what you talked about at the outset, where things are just take longer now? That the processes, even without any, I guess, major legal reform, the processes are longer, or is that just also maybe an impractical standard to basically say, hey, we're going to only let people in who are going to be the best and brightest people who are going to start these giant companies?
I mean, I'd like to think that it's an attainable policy, and frankly, from a business immigration perspective, we want job creators. We don't want job takers. I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that. But I think on the whole, the way this particular administration is going about it just doesn't make sense. We have historically low unemployment rates. We have historically high open jobs. And we're cutting off the flow of legal migration to the United States. And the policies that they're putting forth are taking away more people that have employment authorization. Regardless of your feelings on deferred action for childhood arrivals, temporary protective status for people who are here from war-torn countries, spouses of H-1B visa holders and long green card processing being able to work, they're trying to curtail all of those people from having employment authorization. And if you add up all those individuals, it's another million workers that they're trying to take essentially status away from and the right to work. So, I can understand some of this sentiment in an era where, we have really high unemployment or the country's in a severe recession. It's just illogical at this particular junction from an economic perspective. And I'll be honest with you, man, I'm a registered independent. I've never had a strong affinity to either political party. And that's partially because they kind of flip back and forth on who's going to be advocates and who's going to be de-incentivizing immigration. If you listen to speeches from Reagan and, Bush back in the late 80s and the 90s, it's almost the same words and vocabulary that we're hearing the Democrats use today. George W. Bush, even though he had a tremendous penchant for immigration enforcement, also created bilateral free trade agreements with Chile, Singapore, and Australia that loosened visa regulations for nationals from those countries. And Obama, even though he had a deferred action policy and tried to benefit children, was known amongst immigration advocacy groups as the deporter-in-chief because he had the highest number of people being removed from the country during his administration. So this is not like necessarily something that is really driven by one party or the other. What's interesting about Trump is the fact that immigration is something that used to be kind of like, something that politicians would try to stay away from and would only deal with out of necessity, and he's turned it into a rallying cry for his base. And I think it's this kind of thing that he's even campaigning on now, like promises made, promises kept, where he's trying to say, like, I've struck out to do these things, and if they're not happening, it's because of the so-called judges or, blockage from his own political party. So it's incredibly fascinating because the logic for the policies that are in place does not add up with the economic realities of what the country is facing. And that's not even getting into the humanitarian stuff. We're not even talking about travel bans and separation of families and migrant caravans and, it's...
Well, we will in a minute. We will soon.
It's incredible. Yeah, it really is incredible. So, sorry to go on, but that's...
No, I like it. I appreciate it. I guess, but so you're talking about this time of transition, and I guess how this is not really a party issue. But I guess during what you're going through now, or what this area of the law is going through now, what are clients telling you? I guess are some benefiting, are some reeling, are some enjoying this, or is reform impacting some more than others? I guess what have you been hearing from the people who are, I guess, experiencing this firsthand?
That's a good question. Honestly, I've had a lot of instances where businesses and foreign nationals are sort of pumping the brakes on applying for various petitions or work authorization benefits or changing jobs out of concern over an unpredictability with immigration trends. There was a company, for example, that I was representing out of Ireland that wanted to set up a corrugated box manufacturing facility in Delaware. Okay. And they were looking to hire approximately 40 to 50 U.S. workers to help make these boxes. But they ended up not going through with the project when Trump got elected because they were concerned that they weren't going to be able to get their key managers and executives over to set up the enterprise. And that's having the opposite effect of what the administration is seeking. They're trying to supposedly create jobs for U.S. workers, and to your point, they're saying we want to encourage people to engage in business. Well, here was an allied country looking to dump a few $1 million in the United States to start a subsidiary of their business and create jobs, who essentially self-adjudicated a denial and didn't want to try because of the perceived risk. So it's challenging. And then you couple that with the fact that the worksite enforcement, although it hasn't become mandatory yet, as I did predict, is through the roof. This year alone, over 5,000 companies are being investigated for worksite compliance. That's, record amounts. We're seeing a lot of businesses in Philadelphia being targeted. So it's very real and very, palatable, the changes it's having to business. The best example I can give you, though, is going back to this Canada situation. My firm is headquartered in Toronto, and I had my partner down at our holiday party last year, And I'm giving this speech to my staff, and I'm talking about, how proud I am. They're working hard in this difficult environment. They're persevering through challenging times. My partner's in the back, and he's going, 4 more years, because the business in Canada is booming as a result of these policies. Our Toronto office has increased in size by 50%.
Oh, wow.
50% since Trump took office. And whether it's people that are like looking for that safety valve and being able to migrate to the north, or frankly, these businesses that are looking for homes for their people that have been able to get status, it is a dramatic change.
And on the flip side of that coin, because you just mentioned, I guess, enforcement being, I guess, upped. And I know that, again, in one of your posts, you wrote about, I guess, earlier this year, Southeast Provision in Tennessee had 97 immigrant workers detained. It was the largest raid in the past decade. You also mentioned, I guess, some targeted crackdowns. I know 7-Eleven is a company that you mentioned in that post. I guess, what are you telling your clients? Is it, expect things to be more stringent than ever? Is it more nuanced? I guess, does it vary greatly from client to client? I guess, if the enforcement's up, I guess, what are you telling your clients?
Well, those who have yet to face any significant problems or issues, we are telling them to engage in what we call immigration risk management, sort of reviewing its policies, its procedures, checking their forms I-9, which are like a big compliance form, going over their immigration compliance records, and getting their house in order before they're being investigated. We're finding that to be a very worthwhile exercise for a lot of companies, and that's, regardless if they actually have immigration or not. These rules and regulations are applicable. Just you have a responsibility to ensure the validity of your workforce and its ability to work in the United States. So we're trying to have them doing it in advance. We're trying to have people be proactive with these things. Now, not every company can afford to self-audit.
Sure.
So there's a lot of them that are risk, and frankly, a lot of the ones that are being targeted in certain industries don't even necessarily know that they have an issue because they're just not aware of it. So, it is a real and significant problem. And the enforcement stuff is only going to get worse. There's rumors of them wanting to set up these service centers where, audits of I-9 records are going to become as ubiquitous as filing a tax return. So.
And you talked about, I guess, I think most of our conversation has been talking about, I guess, higher end or special or skilled tech workers. But when you are talking about, I guess, lower end companies, talking about meat packing plants, convenience stores, those, now we're talking about, I guess, more temporary or unskilled workers. I guess how does their situation, and how do companies that employ those people, how does that differ from what we've been talking about so far?
Well, it's an interesting point that you raised. So one of the reasons why I don't have a particular political party affiliation is because neither party over the past, frankly, since the immigration laws were in effect, have been able to figure out a way to have legal immigration to the United States for low-skilled workers. Okay. There's temporary and seasonal visas. There's stuff for agricultural stuff that's called the H-2A and the H-2B category. But there's no mechanism outlined or put in place specifically for year-round low-skilled work. It just doesn't exist. And we can talk about what to do with people who don't have status. We can come up with concepts on, do you do an amnesty? Do you try to kick everybody out? Do you put everybody into removal proceedings? These are things that you can constantly review and debate over. But the bottom line is, until you create a mechanism whereby people can work legally in the United States for these year-round low-skilled visas, dishwashers, people that are doing landscaping stuff in certain climates, housekeepers, these sorts of individuals, you're always going to have illegal immigration, and you're always going to have a legal immigration problem in the United States. So the discussion around immigration that I find so infuriating is looking at the symptoms. It's saying we have all these people here, we don't know what to do with them. And some people will say, well, we need to kick them all out because they're taking jobs and ruining our resources. And other people say we should give them all status because that's the right thing to do by our fellow humans who are living among us, who are part of our communities. And then certainly, as you can imagine, I come down on the humanitarian side of the
Sure,
equation.
yeah.
But the reality is that question is really secondary to why are these people here illegally? What is it about our system that is encouraging this behavior? And why don't we say once and for all, let's let these people come out from the shadows. Let's let them have a mechanism to be here legally. And if you have a mechanism to be here legally and you don't follow it, then yes, enforce the immigration laws. Come down on the employers. But until you provide that mechanism, this problem is going to continue to exist. And we have to wake up, frankly, as a country and say it's beyond child separation. It's beyond building a wall. It's about finding a solution within the law that will allow these people to take their place in our society. And if it means going out for a meal costs $10 more, or buying a particular item costs $10 more, then so be it. That's part of our collective burden to change the way we view low-skilled workers in the United States.
Now, you just mentioned, it's beyond the wall, it's beyond all that. So I'd like to talk about the wall and all that real quick, because I know that you made, I think, a pretty eloquent point in that there aren't a lot of options for these low-skilled workers to come here legally. But there is a lot of, I guess, interest in these workers in particular, particularly coming from both the Middle East and Central America and Mexico. So I do want to talk about some of the more, I guess, hot news topics. Before we get there, I think one of the cool things that we have as law students is we get to, while we're in law school, we're kind of looking at the world around us, what's going on in our field. And obviously in early 2017, many of us were looking at our television screens, on Twitter, seeing what happened with the, I guess, the travel ban, the Muslim ban, whatever you'd like to call it. You actually had the opportunity in your role to help a Syrian family in Allentown. I guess before we talk about some of the other things that are going on more recently, would you care to, I guess, briefly talk us through that experience? Because I imagine it was a pretty cool one.
Yeah, honestly, it was probably the biggest case I'll ever have in my career. I mean, just in terms of a confluence of factors leading to attention nationally in an immigration matter. Mm-hmm. And it was incredibly rewarding because I was provided an opportunity to help and was really able to do so on a pro bono basis, which doesn't really come along that often. But from a human interest perspective, it was quite incredible. Here you have Syrian Christians who had gone through the legal immigration process, had been in process for almost, I think it was like 14 years, doing every single step the way you're supposed to, waiting in the line, doing it correctly, okay? They're from Syria, and they're not Muslim, okay? And then on top of it, their sponsors voted and were Trump supporters, okay? And here you have this ban that comes out on a Friday night that, frankly, if you read the thing as lawyers, it looks like it was written in crayon on the back of a Denny's menu. I mean, it made like no sense. But you didn't even know who was covered, who wasn't covered. They released it on Friday night at 7 p.m., so nobody has a chance to read it. And this family was already in the air. They were already on our way here. So it's not even like they had an option, And they land and they have all these problems and they get, turned away at the border and eventually sent back. And I received the call on a Saturday morning, which is a good little lesson for future lawyers out there. If you see a number you don't know, pick up the phone because it might be a case instead of spam. Okay.
Okay.
But I got a
I
call
assume
on a
spam.
Saturday morning, and it was the petitioner's family, and they're saying, Jonathan, our family is stuck at the border. Can you help? And normally I can suss these things out with a phone call, and here I'm saying to myself, well, there's no way this can apply to this family because they're not even Muslim, Christian, etc. But they were turned back. And another really critical point in this entire case story is it was at that moment that I realized that this case was beyond me. It wasn't just about me being a lawyer. It was the serious consequences of this policy coming to fruition. So I actually called some of the best immigration litigators that I know in the city. We got in touch with the ACLU. We had this emergency convening of a meeting at my office on Sunday. I'll never forget it. And I get a call that morning and it's saying that Governor Wolf wants to come by your office to
Oh.
see what you're doing to help this family. So all of a sudden, on this Saturday morning, it's a regular Saturday morning for me. I go from this to like having the biggest case I've ever dealt with. And to be frank, I mean, my role was more coordination than anything. I was working with the ACLU. They were drafting the briefs to file in federal court, working with Charlie Dent's office when he was still holding a seat in the House and liaisoning with Customs and Border Protection, working with the ACLU's public relations director to learn how to use the media to advance the case of your clients when I would say up until that point, every single other client I want doesn't want anybody to know that they have immigration help.
Yeah.
And it was a crazy 10-day roller coaster that ended up with Customs and Border Protection kind of striking a deal through Charlie Dent's office to have the family admitted. And me and another fellow that was working on the case, Joe Hohenstein, who's actually running for state rep. Make sure you go out and vote on Tuesday, everybody.
Yeah.
Or if this is aired after Tuesday, I hope you voted. Yeah, we went up there and we were at JFK when they got off the plane and they came through immigration, and it was a spectacularly rewarding moment. But yes, to see the families and to see the families reunited, but also because we averted a constitutional crisis as a country. And we did it by exercising the rights of the Constitution that's afforded to all people. And what I mean by that is, you have a president who lays down this executive order, which is, in my opinion, clearly discriminatory in intent. You have the power of the people to assemble, to have their voices heard, to go to the airport, to protest, lining up in mass, and you have a district court that issues an injunction. And at that moment, when that injunction was issued, I don't want to minimize this because it was this serious. That's one of those moments where the strength of the Constitution was fully tested. Because if the executive branch had said, we don't care what the district court says, in the name of security, we're enacting this ban, the Constitution would have truly failed. But instead, even this very aggressive executive branch kowtowed to the weight of the judiciary. And that moment gave me a tremendous amount of faith in the way our system operates, in the way the way our country functions within the system, and truly the power that all of us have. It was remarkable. So, yeah, to say, I will never forget it for my entire life. Do I wish that it would not have happened? The answer is truly yes, because the confusion and the hatred and everything and the pandemonium was just ridiculous. But in a weird sort of way, that whole experience made me even prouder to be an American rather than embarrassed by what our administration was doing.
And I do want to talk about two other issues. Now that was an awesome story, but I guess other things that have come up along. I guess obviously that was one of the first big immigration moves of the administration, but a few others have come along. But and I guess in response to this more aggressive immigration policy, there are some people who have talked about the role of ICE, and some politicians have criticized ICE. Some have called it for it to be abolished. I know a lot of social functions and parades and whatnot. There's been abolish ICE banners and whatnot, and others have kind of sort of used this rhetoric against opponents. As you mentioned, the midterms are coming up in just a week. This is obviously something that some people are going to the polls thinking about. As somebody who understands the role of ICE probably more than anybody else I'm likely to talk to in the next week, can you talk a little bit about ICE's role pre-2017 and how that might have changed, or maybe it hasn't changed that much and we're just more sensitive or more aware of their role?
Okay, so I don't think ICE's role has really changed all that much, to be honest with you. And I'm certainly not in the camp to abolish ICE.
Yeah.
Immigration enforcement is actually a very small portion of what Immigration and Customs Enforcement does as an agency. They're constantly on the lookout for people who are engaging in human trafficking, the sex trade, child pornography. I mean, if you actually read ICE's website and the type of enforcement activities that they're engaging in, it goes beyond that. And even more so, they're the ones that are like helping the FBI and the CIA snuff out terrorist cells, and they do an amazing amount of good work. I think honestly it's an unfortunate rhetoric that the liberals were using in saying abolish ICE at the time of the child separation, because what they should have done, although it would not have been as politically headline grabbing, but the real sentiment should be, we need to modify ICE's mission. We need to refocus the direction of what this body does, if that's really what they were trying to portray. I fret in some ways, and not to get too political, but I think that this rhetoric will backfire, especially with more moderate voters. But I mean, I'm no political expert. But to say ICE should be abolished, I think it's a bridge too far, personally. Even on the immigration enforcement, I mean, for the most part, especially, what we saw under the Obama administration, they were really solely focused on finding criminal aliens, people that have come across the border multiple times, who have engaged in a variety of fraudulent activities to enter the United States. So that's the big difference, really. Before, under the Obama administration, the mission of ICE was to look for specific individuals, and they came across people who were otherwise contributing members of society. If they came across them within their day-to-day activities, they would not prosecute. Now, it's if you encounter anybody who doesn't have status, you're supposed to apprehend and put into removal proceedings. So that's the big change there. But to say, get rid of this entire agency that has this mammoth job in protecting our country, I think is foolhardy.
And you mentioned before, I guess, the use of executive orders. If I was a half-decent host, I would have asked you this question right away, but I did not. I guess speaking on executive orders, there's obviously a lot of talk, really just the past day or so, about a proposal to end birthright citizenship via executive order, something a lot of people have said is unconstitutional. There's also, I guess at least ahead of the midterms, there's this so-called caravan that some news outlets and President Trump have reported is coming up in Central America. The number of people, who exactly they are, if it even exists, kind of really seems to change hour by hour. And then this is all coming on the heels of, I guess, as you mentioned earlier, the Mexican border and then, I guess, family separation. That's like 20 questions in one. But I guess in a very politically charged issue, and obviously, again, this is something that people are thinking about headed to the polls next week. I guess, do you anticipate any sort of resolution along the southern border in terms of how we're bringing people into this country? Does it tie back to what you mentioned earlier about, I guess, a better way of legalizing, people who are not necessarily super high skilled workers into coming here illegally? I guess, or is there no resolution at all from your standpoint in terms of how we are kind of interacting with our neighbors to the south?
Okay, so that's a good question.
I'm sorry.
It's multiple layers. No, I will start by saying I think you're a good host, so don't worry about that. But
I was fishing.
Yeah, no, I could tell. So just to kind of my personal opinion is I hate executive orders across the board. I don't care who's giving them out, frankly. I think, and this has been a consistent trend amongst the executive branch for multiple administrations. They keep issuing more and more of these things. Obama, this first time that he went for election, he said that he was going to do away with executive orders completely. He was going to work with Congress, and then he ends up, after 2 terms, being the biggest user of them in the history of presidency. And you see the fallacy with executive orders because the DREAM Act was not actually an act. It was an executive order that gave status to these people that were brought here as children and gave them employment authorizations. It was done through executive order. Well, the next administration can come along and say, we want to de-executive order this.
Sure.
And I hate to say it, but I think when this stuff finally makes it through the courts, they're going to side with Trump on this one because if it was created by executive order, it can be taken away by executive order, regardless of whether or not I think it's a good policy or not. That's the reality of it. So I personally believe we have to protect the ability for Congress to be the ones that actually effectuate the laws. And we should all be fearful of executive orders regardless of who's in power and who's making them.
Mm-hmm.
That's my feeling on executive orders. Now, with respect to the southern border and what's going on here, that's a little bit different than what we were talking about before. These people are actually coming to seek asylum, to come to the United States because they fear prosecution or persecution in their home country. This is a result of the gang violence, the war-torn nature of some parts of Honduras and Nicaragua. So these people are coming for humanitarian reasons and under, a variety of conventions and treaties and our own policies. If you show up at the border and you claim that you're being persecuted, you should be admitted and you have a right to a hearing for asylum. The fact of the matter is I think with this caravan, it's almost becoming a self-fulfilling policy by this particular administration because they did this caravan has been going on for years and years and years, but it was just last year that it got attention. Because Trump called them out and made it a media flashpoint, and this year it's even bigger. What are they going to do? I don't know how this is going to play out, to be honest with you. This one is really hard to predict. They just released 5,000 military personnel to the border, but I think we're bound. You have to double check me on this one, but I think we're bound by the Geneva Treaty that we have to hear their asylum claim. Not 100% sure. I'm going off of that on memory, but I think we have an obligation to do it. So it will be interesting to see how it plays out. Now, the military's there because Trump has been talking about how there's terrorists intermingled with the people that are crossing, and nobody's been able to provide proof, and but that's the justification. So, I think it's really messy, and it's all coming right around election time. And people are throwing mud on both sides of it, and, the way these things tend to play out, it'll probably be Tuesday when they reach the border. Who knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, that seems likely.
But I don't think, I was just going to say, I don't think, as Trump has suggested, that this is a Democrat-driven initiative. But I don't really know how that one's going to play out.
And do you have any thoughts on? And I know you said you generally don't like executive orders, but a lot of people have said this birthright citizenship is in the 14th Amendment. You can't change it unilaterally. I guess do you agree with that? Do you feel as though there's some
Oh, I
wiggle room
think that
there?
that's absolute bananas.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, to say I'm going to overturn the 14th Amendment through executive order and not allow birthright citizenship, I mean, that's pure political rhetoric. And what I would say to them is, well, if that's the case, why don't you write an executive order banning guns away from the Second Amendment if you can just go willy-nilly executive order out amendments?
Yeah.
It's like, I think just the way that sort of a $10,000 middle class tax break popped up last week, we're hearing about taking
My
away
versus out of
birthright.
session.
Yeah. No.
Okay.
I think this is purely campaign rhetoric. But, the problem is that it gets a lot of attention. And
Sure.
a certain amount of the population is going to hear it and believe it. And frankly, he can draft it up. It will be, I think, rarely dismissed and removed. But I guess if he wanted to try, he could. But I don't see any foundation in law or jurisprudence that would permit something like that.
And finally, it is late Tuesday evening, and I've taken up a ton of your time. But I would like to end this conversation the way that we've ended all the others before. Thanksgiving's a few weeks away, and many of us spend time with our family and friends. And these family and friends have widely different views on pretty much everything from us, including immigration. And we'll all probably be having maybe one too many glasses of wine all along the way. Is there a facet, I guess, if the invariable conversation about politics or immigration comes up, at the dinner table, is there a facet or two of this kind of discussion of what you've been seeing in your area of the law that particularly interests you that you think might be worth discussion or might be worth just average Joe's thinking about, for better or worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would encourage people to think about that issue that I was talking about before, about are we treating the symptoms or are we really looking at the cause of why we have an immigration issue? I think that is a debate that I would encourage fully because I think it's something that's not really understood or discussed. But more than that, I think we also have to just remember what the foundation of this country is. It's based on immigration. And that's something we can't turn our backs on because it's part of our DNA. And I'm often asked to speak at naturalization ceremonies in my alma mater, high school, because they have this thing every year where they do a naturalization ceremony. And one of the things I talk about is what defines America. And one of the things that really defines this country is our entrepreneurial spirit. And I once asked a group of immigrant investors why they decided to come to the United States. Why, with all the turmoil that we're dealing with now, have they chosen this country? And their answer still resonates with me, and it is, in the United States, you're applauded for just trying. Even if you fail, you've succeeded because you've tried. And the beautiful thing is, if you fail, you can try, and you can try again until you succeed. And that aspect of the United States is undying. It's why people want to invest here. It's why people want to innovate here. It's why if you look at the Fortune 50 companies in the United States, they were either founded by an immigrant or the son or daughter of an immigrant. It's in our DNA. This is the melting pot. This is where, like we were kind of talking about earlier, the best and the brightest come together to try. And if we start to turn our backs on that, if we cut that from our core being as a country, I think we will lose something that makes this place so special. And that's immigration to me. It's about believing in your own entrepreneurial spirit. It's about taking a chance to make your life better. It's about coming to this country where it is as close to a level playing field as you can get anywhere in the world. And that goes beyond an administration. It goes beyond policy. It goes beyond hateful rhetoric and hate crimes. it is American. So as we celebrate America and we give thanks for what we have, I think it's also important to remember what helped us become what we are today. And that's immigration.
Beautiful. Well, Jonathan, I've kept you way past when I told you I'd keep you, and I know it's late, but it was really lovely speaking with you, and thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
Have a great night.
Go Owls.